Please be seated. I love our reading this morning from Ephesians, where Paul is writing to the church in Ephesus, and he talks about putting on the armor of God. And I love that reading because it is one of the lessons that the church uses when we celebrate the life and ministry of Martin Luther King Jr. We have scriptures that are appointed for that day in January, and I know this because I was ordained on that day in January many years ago, several years ago. And I love these readings, this passage from Ephesians. I will tell you that on that day, the preacher was our own presiding bishop, Michael Curry. Unfortunately, he didn't preach on Ephesians, so I can't borrow from him in this sermon. But this very practical advice that Paul gives us about the footwear of preachers. Paul gives us a list of abstract things that one is to put on with the armor of God: the belt of truth, the breastplate of righteousness, the helmet of salvation, the shield of faith. But when it comes to shoes, he says to wear whatever makes you ready to proclaim the gospel of peace. It's a very practical piece of advice that he's giving to the people in Ephesus, to wear shoes that are comfortable enough to preach in. I really took this to heart when I became a priest, and my most comfortable pair of shoes at the time happened to be bright red. Some of you who knew me before now know that those red shoes followed me for quite some time until I wore a hole in them just before coming to the cathedral. I don't know if that was a good or a bad thing, but I had to find a new pair of preaching shoes. It might seem a little eccentric for Paul to be talking about the footwear of preachers, and yet he's not alone. If we look at the prophet Isaiah, one of the passages that takes up a large piece of Handel's Messiah is how beautiful are the feet of those who preach the gospel of peace. How beautiful are the feet of those who preach the gospel of peace. So there is this thread throughout the Hebrew tradition and the Christian tradition about preachers and feet. What is this about? You might think that it would be about the mouth, how beautiful is the mouth, or the tongue, or even the lungs or the mind, but no, it's the feet. I think that there could be several reasons for this. One is the truism that actions speak louder than words, that we are called to preach with our lives. One quote that is often attributed to St. Francis of Assisi is to preach the gospel always, and when necessary, use words. And so all of us are called to preach with our lives, with our actions, with the way that we walk. When we look at our gospel today, Jesus starts out saying that those who eat my flesh and drink my blood abide in me, and I abide in them. And while that sounds scandalous, or as the disciples say, difficult, in Hebrew tradition, whenever you paired blood and flesh together to say flesh and blood, it meant the whole person. Jesus is saying, take all of me. Jesus is offering his whole self. And when we accept Jesus' whole self, we abide in him and he in us. To abide with means to stick with or remain with. And as you know, Jesus is always on the move. And so if Jesus is always on the move and we are called to abide in him and he in us, if we are to stick with Jesus, to remain with Jesus, we too must be on the move. It's no wonder the disciples said that this teaching is difficult. It's a workout. And so I wonder, what do your preaching shoes look like? What do your preaching shoes look like? Are they shoes for walking, for off-roading? Are they shoes that are made to look pretty? Are they shoes that are well worn and starting to show wear and tear? Or are they shoes that are still slick on the bottoms from lack of use? What do your preaching shoes look like? All of us are called to preach. And as much fun as it might be to have an open mic night right here, instead, we are invited to preach with our lives. I mentioned Martin Luther King at the beginning of the sermon. One of the things that he had with the beloved community was a commitment card. It was a commitment to nonviolence. And so before one could come and demonstrate with Martin Luther King Jr., there was a commitment card that had several things listed that one had to pledge to. The very first one was to meditate daily on the life and teachings of Jesus Christ. He also said to pray daily. He said to keep your body and your spirit healthy and strong. All of these things that are so similar to what Paul said to the church in Ephesus. Paul's words rang true for Ephesus. Martin Luther King's words rang true during the civil rights movement. And all of these words are still applicable today because it is a timeless message that we are called to put on the armor of God. And I hope that when you do so, that you are so mindful of what your preaching shoes are and what kind of life and vocation of proclaiming the gospel of peace that invites you and me into. Amen.